Good evening. Good evening. We're going to get started. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of this new school department at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and I'm very glad you could join us for the 10th and final event in the school's year-long series this year on polarization and civil disagreement, confronting America's civic crisis. The series this year has included individual speaker events and interviews with the speakers, some dialogue events, and a two-day conference in February. We must have had 25 speakers there. We're very glad again this year to have had two ASU major partners, the O'Connor College of Law and the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. This series on polarization and remedies for it is the sequel to our inaugural year series in 2017-2018 on free speech and intellectual diversity in higher education and American society. For both of these years, we have been collaborating with Arizona PBS to record all the events in the series, and they are then broadcast locally as shorter episodes on Channel 8, and then we package them into a series. And then all of these public events are kept in a video archive on the school's website, which you can see in various places, SCETL at asu.edu. If you look under the video tab on the website, you can find an archive of everything. That's true of events we have outside of this major speaker series and last year's series. So we have an annual Constitution Day event in September. We have an annual Martin Luther King Day event in January, and many other speaker events. Our aim in all of this is to provide a public forum for civil disagreement and debate. And so as I look around, I'm delighted to see friends with us from other departments and units here at the university, members of the Phoenix community. I know one member of the Arizona Board of Regents is here. We were supposed to have some members of the state legislature with us tonight, other leaders of institutions in civil society in the area. And I saw, there he is, Stanley James is here, the Vice Provost at ASU for Inclusion and Community Engagement is with us here tonight. So just a few more words from me about the school's mission and the larger rationale for this kind of series, and then I will introduce our distinguished speaker. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership exists to restore in American higher education the connection between liberal education and civic education. And we undertake civic education both with our students in the university and with the broader community. Our students discuss great works of moral and economic thought, economic and political thought together, American thought, and all of that as a foundation preparation for leadership. Beyond our classroom, we organize speaker events like this. We also have special international courses, a trip that goes to India as an intensive 10-day course. A new course we're developing happens in May in Israel and the West Bank. Those courses are meant to expose American students to liberal democracy in other regions of the world, other civilizational traditions. You have on display here over to the side 3 items, I think, from our Civic Classics collection, which is a collaboration with the university. So one of a few hundred copies left in the world, we think, of the first printing in 1788 of the Federalist, better known as the Federalist Papers. We also have a 1796 printing shortly after George Washington published his farewell address, retiring from public life. And we have a first edition from 1845 of Frederick Douglass's narratives, his autobiography of his early life. And we have many more of those, but during the reception period, you should take a look at those. So lots of information on the school out in the lobby, especially for students here to learn about our courses for the fall. We have a major, we have a minor, we have a new BS degree coming online for the fall, and please do spread the word. Our belief is that this is a broad, diverse curriculum, great for American leaders in whatever profession or walks of life they want to choose. And we also have this principle in mind that if we can restore some attention to fundamental and common points of debate, fundamental principles, that will help to calm down our very angry, polarized civic discourse. So to our speaker, a perfect person to finish this year of events on polarization and civil disagreement. She's going to provide all the answers to all of our questions that we've had since September. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and the Director of Harvard's Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics. She's also a professor in the Department of Government and in the Graduate School of Education. Before joining Harvard, she was the UPS Foundation Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She was the first African-American faculty member appointed to that institute, which was Albert Einstein's home for 2 decades. She also is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post in all her spare time. Professor Allen is the author of 6 books. I'll mention just 3 of them. An early book, I think her first, The World of Prometheus, The Politics of Punishing in Democratic Athens. That reflects, I think, one of her 2 PhD degrees, the one in classics. Most recently, a book entitled Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. And then in the middle, a book I think she will refer to tonight, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, which won the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society for American Historians. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Philosophical Society. She's also the winner of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. She'll probably talk tonight about the fact that within the Safra Center, she's the director of the Democratic Knowledge Project. We have 3 parts to these sorts of events. Professor Allen will speak for about 30-35 minutes. Then in the second part, the 2 of us will be in these chairs, and I'll pose some questions to her. The third part is particularly for you, so be thinking of questions you would like to pose from the floor. After that, we have a reception for everyone. So please join me in welcoming for a discussion of democratic knowledge, a roadmap for rebuilding civic education, Danielle Allen.
Good evening. Well, there you go, thank you. One more time, good evening. Good evening. Great to see you all. Thank you very much for coming out. I think we're engaged in this conversation on one of the most important topics confronting us as a society at the moment. That said, I'm going to start not from a problem of polarization, but from a problem of agreement, intense agreement among millennials. Some of you may have picked up this particular data point from political scientist Yascha Mounk and his collaborator. But it would appear that 70% of millennials agree that it's not essential to live in a democracy. So that's not polarization. That's intense agreement that democracy is not necessary. Now, for older generations, generations born before World War II, the figures are reversed. 72% of the generation born before World War II believes it is essential to live in a democracy for human well-being, for human flourishing. So we had a generation that agreed on the value of democracy, and now we have a generation that agrees in disputing the value of democracy. So the polarization happened in between those 2 generations, or those sets of book-ending generations, and I think is a part of the explanation for why we are where we are. But my talk tonight is oriented towards thinking about what it would mean for us to aspire to rebuild a supermajority of citizens, 80% of citizens who believe that it is essential to live in a democracy, and in addition to believing that, know what it takes to build and maintain a healthy democracy over time and have the skills and practices to succeed at that. Right, so that's the basic theme of my talk tonight, that our problem is not polarization, but agreement among millennials that we don't need democracy. And our job is to figure out what to do about that. What's happened? I'm actually going to bounce around a little bit in my slides here, try not to give away too much as I move. So you all know the basic facts of our history with civic education. In the middle of the 20th century, in every high school, you could find 3 courses in civics for high school graduates. Now, that's extremely uncommon. The quantity of time spent in schools on social studies has fallen meaningfully since No Child Left Behind. The inequities also reflect our socioeconomic disparities. The declines have been even more severe in under-resourced schools than in better-resourced schools. What people don't often pay enough attention to is how polarization itself has contributed to this problem. all right? So many of you will know about the Common Core State Standards that the National Governors Association developed in the years 2003, 2004, and so on. This was a goal on the part of the governors to claim on behalf of their states authority over setting educational standards. That is, they didn't want that authority to rest with the federal government as it did in No Child Left Behind. They wanted to reclaim authority for the states, and so they took on the job of building agreement across states for standards that would drive testing in schools. When the governors set out to do this, their aspiration was to have standards in the STEM area, in English language arts, and in social studies. They built standards in the STEM area. They built standards in English language arts. They failed to build standards in social studies because of polarization, because they couldn't come to agreement on how we should narrate the basic tale of American history. The dispute is familiar, you will recognize it. There are those who think the emphasis should be on the successes of our history, the design of our institutions, the triumphal creation of a continental country with a powerful economy and a powerful military. And then there are the versions of history that focus on honest truths about slavery and the genocide of Native Americans and the changes in hierarchies over time in our country. And those two histories have lived as separate tales, separate narratives. And in the conflict over which narrative to use, the National Governors Association broke down in its ability to develop standards for social studies. With what consequence? There haven't been any accountability mechanisms in social studies across the entire country. And that's why we don't have time in school for social studies, for civics. So our polarization is the reason kids don't get to learn stuff. We adults have to take responsibility for that, I believe. And so the argument I want to make tonight is for how we can reclaim a body of democratic knowledge that we can share and use as the ground for rebuilding civic education. I'll say more a little bit later, further on in my remarks, about what has happened with civic education in our policy landscape, but what I want to do now is turn to a basic definition of democratic knowledge to help us think about what is this education that we ought to be delivering to citizens? What kind of education might reverse the data point such that young people think democracy is not essential and help them recover the view that it is essential? For me, the single most effective statement of what democratic citizens need to know in order to be effective citizens and support their democracy is in the Declaration of Independence. It's in the second sentence of the Declaration. So let me just remind you of that sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Tell the truth. Did you remember it was that long? That's the whole sentence. All of the self-evident truths, they constitute what philosophers call a syllogism. Two premises with a conclusion that follows necessarily from the premises. Premise one, people have rights. Premise two, we build governments to secure those rights. Conclusion, if governments aren't doing their job securing those rights, it's our job to alter and lay the foundation on new principles and organize the powers as we think is most likely to affect our safety and happiness. So in other words, the conclusion of this sentence points specifically to the citizenly responsibility to make ongoing judgments about the relationship between principle and how we organize our institutions of government. That last clause is the most important one. It's the one that spells out citizenly action and responsibility. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish and to institute new government, laying the foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. If we scrutinize that clause, we can get very clear on the epistemic needs, the knowledge needs for successful democratic citizenship. First, there's a moment of diagnosis, when a government becomes destructive of these ends. How do you make judgments about that? You have to be able to think about society, to be able to think about economic questions, to be able to think about social relations, to be able to think about whether or not human beings are flourishing and prospering. So you need an array of disciplines from the social sciences. You need economics, you need history, you need sociology, you need psychology. You need all of those things to diagnose how well a human society is doing. And if you judge that things are not going well, you need to be able to diagnose an alternative. You have to be able to look at the structure of our institutions and our laws and our policies and figure out where they're hindering flourishing. So you need to be able to think about laws. You need to be able to think about how our decisions in our legislatures have direct impacts in people's lives, how our economic policies affect whether communities in the Rust Belt, for example, are flourishing or not. You have to be able to draw connections between those collective decisions and impacts in the immediate experience of ordinary citizens. So you do need law, and you need policymaking, and you need education in our political institutions, all right? But in order to figure out where to go, if you want to design a solution to a problem, then you need inquiry into this foundation on principles that the sentence articulates. Is it liberty we're pursuing? Is it equality? What's the relationship between liberty and equality? Is it fairness? Is it liberty and justice for all? Is it inclusion? Which of these values, what combination of them, what package of them gives us our North Star for beginning to design a solution? How do you begin to think about those ideals? Kids do actually, from the very beginning, think about them. What parent has not heard a kid say, "That's not fair"? Kids are political philosophers from the very beginning. And the question is whether or not our educational system can help them become sophisticated in their thoughts about fairness and justice and liberty and equality and inclusion and flourishing for our society. But that too, you need the philosophical foundations of democracy and education and some of the texts that supported the design of the institutions in the first place. Not just the Constitution, but also the Federalist Papers and things like Montesquieu and Locke that help you think about that. And even documents like those of Prince Hall, a free African American who lived in Boston in the late 18th century and was the first person to use the ideals of the Declaration of Independence for a project other than revolution. In January of 1777, he submitted a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly arguing for emancipation and abolition. And he used exactly this language to make the case, calling in 1777 to the disjunction between the embrace of self-governance by the colonists for themselves and the continued maintenance of slavery. And by 1780, slavery had been in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Vermont. Because Vermont was still its own country at the time, as it still sort of is, I can't say by 1783 states had abolished slavery, only 2, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, but Vermont did make it a third by 1780. So the point is that that too gives us access to the philosophical foundations of democracy, the petitions that Prince Hall submitted to the Massachusetts Assembly. And students need access to these texts in order to be able to explore the foundation of principle and to work in political debate, to pull out the ideals and understand them and work with each other. So they need a body of knowledge that's about society. They need a body of knowledge that's about our political institutions. They need a body of knowledge that is about the philosophical foundations and ideals of democracy in order to make these constant judgments and do the work of constantly redesigning the institutions we use together. But they need something else too. And if you look at this sentence really closely, you can see what it is. So I'm going to just focus here again. So if you read the whole sentence and pay attention to the movement from the beginning of the sentence to the end, you'll notice something really important. The first premise is about individual rights. We pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By the way, I hope you noticed that was a list of examples, right? Unalienable rights, among which are, it's not a complete list, so it's an invitation to think about what our unalienable rights are and how to account for them. Okay, but we start there with my rights, me, what I'm going to do. And by the end of the sentence, we're talking about our safety and happiness, plural, their safety and happiness, our safety and happiness. So the practice of citizenship articulated in this sentence is about the transition from I to we, about how we work together through our shared institutions to make collective choices and decisions. Part of those choices and decisions are about securing our individual rights, but that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is the fact that we work together and we are securing our collective safety and happiness. Now, how on earth does any human being get from I to we? To some extent, that is about a moral orientation, a constant habit of asking the question, how do I make this about more than myself? How do I think about others? How do I think about my bigger community? It's a matter of taking responsibility. But it's not just that. It's also about actual practices and habits and skills. The deepest, most profound secret in the Declaration of Independence is that for each one of us, there is no other human being on earth who can do a better job than we can for ourselves of identifying what happiness might be for us. Did you follow that? Okay. For each one of us, that's the case. And consequently, if I want to link my happiness to your happiness, if I want to link my happiness to your happiness, I can only do that if I listen to you. I need you to tell me about your happiness. I can't ascertain that from on high or a priori. The only way we can get from I to we is by building actual practices of collaboration and coordination that involve listening to each other and hearing how the world looks from a different perspective. Now that sounds very abstract, but the simple fact of the matter is that the core invention of our political institutions, representation, is exactly that. That's the point of representation. It is a structure by which people articulate their views as best they can through a mechanism of voting, and then representatives have the job of coordinating and synthesizing those views and trying to generate decisions. So representation is only one mechanism that we have for trying to listen to each other and to synthesize our different pictures of happiness into some collective whole. But it's one very concrete example of that abstract idea. The point, though, goes beyond that, because we don't do this just through our big formal institutions, Congress and the like. The fact of the matter is that we do this work of listening and coordinating and synthesizing a shared picture every time we say, serve on a committee. And I know there are lots of faculty members in this room. My guess is that lots of the students are in student organizations that have committees. Here's another secret about democracies. Democracies have more committees than any other kind of political form. Why? Because that's how you do the work of making sure that people can articulate their pictures of happiness and try as best they can to find the points of overlap, points of common purpose, so that they can build something together from them. So to move from I to we, you actually need the nitty-gritty skills of learning how to get a bunch of people around the table to talk about a hard problem. You need the nitty-gritty skills of knowing how to chair a committee meeting. You need the nitty-gritty skills of knowing how to find allies and people from a different organization who might share your point of view. You can bring them to the same table and move something forward together. So when the Declaration articulates this move from what I do to what we do, it's pointing to a set of skills that are necessary for democratic coordination. So this sentence, I believe, gives us a beautiful picture of the core elements of democratic knowledge. Knowledge about how you organize the powers of government, that is about political institutions. Knowledge of the foundations and principle, the philosophical foundations of democracy. And then the need for knowledge about how to convert I to we through practices of communication, persuasion, coordination, running committees, finding allies, and so forth. You need all three of those things to sustain the basic work of democracy. All right, so if it was all so easy, if the recipe for civic education has been right there, right in front of us all the time in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, why do we have such a hard time figuring out what civic education is about? This is where we get back to polarization. Now, I am sure that as you're sitting listening to me, a few of you are thinking, well, what about that language, all men are created equal? What about the exclusions of women that that phrase articulates? What about the problem of slavery? At the same time that they were writing this sentence, they're supporting slavery, entrenching it in the Constitution, and so forth. How, Danielle, can you hold up this sentence and expect me to take it seriously as a guide, given the historical facts of the moment? Some of you were thinking that, right? Yeah. So this is where we get back to the question of whether or not we can build a shared narrative for our history, and whether or not we can understand the full complexity of the history of this document and the others. So I'm going to share a little bit more of the history of this document and then try to think together about what it would mean to build historical narratives that we could broadly subscribe to. So let me say to start that in my own work, what I aspire to when I write about the history of the founding, write about the history of other periods of the country, is to generate narratives that are appreciative of the founding generation, but not deifying, that are honest about the crimes and errors, crimes of omission and commission, but not cynical, all right? Appreciative but not deifying, honest but not cynical. Those are my guardrails for how to think about a fair history for this country. So what does that mean in this case, thinking about the Declaration of Independence? Let me talk about the language here, and let me talk about this paragraph. I mentioned Prince Hall already, free African American in Boston. And I mentioned that he had made use of this text in 1777, and when he did, he helped crystallize the abolitionist movement. In other words, the Declaration of Independence is as much an origin of abolition as it is the result of the pen of Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder. All right? Now, what's the importance of that? This country has always had multiple intellectual traditions operating simultaneously. It is literally impossible to attribute to the whole of any generation in this country's life the sins of a part of that generation. Abolition started in 1776, even as the country was making compromises around slavery that protected slavery. We have to recognize the multiplicity of traditions in our country in order to have an honest history, and one that permits appreciating what deserves appreciation while making honest judgments about those things that were failures. So that's the first step, is to recognize the multiplicity of traditions operating simultaneously. And I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of just how much it was the case that multiple traditions were operating simultaneously. The decisions of Continental Congress depended inevitably on what philosophers call an overlapping consensus. The agreement to go together in a certain direction for different reasons, okay? I'm driving west with you because I want to visit my mom in LA. You want to go to the beach, but we're going the same direction. That's an overlapping consensus, okay? Now, in the Declaration, just to give you some very concrete examples, there are a couple of critical compromises, one around religion and one around slavery, all right? So the compromise around religion is that, in fact, Thomas Jefferson did not include any of the words for religion in his first draft. He didn't use the word creator, he didn't use the word divine providence, he didn't use the word supreme judge. Those were added by Congress, all right? And the words that Congress added about religion were very carefully calibrated not to imply any particular kind of theology or specific religion. Divine providence, supreme judge, creator. They're not Christian words particularly, all right? That's a really important point. They were building language that permitted both those who were believers, were Christian believers, and those who were not, and even some who were atheists, to sign on to the same document. So in the very beginning, they talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, and they were giving people two different bases for signing on. Those who wanted to accept there was a basic picture of human nature that justified democracy, and those who wanted to base that understanding on a conception of God's creation of human beings. So you had two different reasons for endorsing the principles, and that's an example of overlapping consensus. The compromise on slavery is also really critical, and we tend not to see it. In Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration, there is a passage in which he condemns King George for the slave trade. He describes the slave trade and condemns the king for violating, quote, the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people in Africa. In other words, he used exactly the same vocabulary for the basic rights of Africans as he uses in this sentence for the rights of colonists, all right? So an extraordinary statement of human equality there. Congress cut that passage, all right? So that was a pro-slavery decision by Congress to get rid of that critique of slavery. However, at the same time, in this sentence, we get a moment that was an anti-slavery moment. The phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was self-consciously chosen to avoid the word property. The reason for this is that by June of 1776, the word property and the rights of property were already being used to defend slavery. So in the fall of 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had issued a proclamation that any enslaved person who escaped a plantation and fought for the British would receive freedom from the British. That radicalized the Virginians. It brought them into the revolution. It was their reason for finally deciding absolutely to fight the king. And from that point on, the Virginians started criticizing the king for having violated their property rights by touching the institution of slavery. So by the spring of 1776, there was a debate underway in Congress about how to think about what they were pursuing. Was it property or was it something else? And John Adams, from Massachusetts, who is in fact the intellectual architect of the Declaration, began arguing that the language to use was happiness. That the end of government, he said, as is the end of man, is happiness. This is something that he wrote in a pamphlet called Some Thoughts on Government that he published in April of 1776. We can see the debate in process when George Mason drafts the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And he argues, he writes a sentence very like this one, and argues that the purpose of government is to protect both the securing and acquiring of property and the pursuit of happiness. He takes property and happiness and puts them together. By the time we get to July, the committee working with Jefferson to draft the Declaration has settled on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They have self-consciously chosen not to use the property term. And in the same period of time, Benjamin Franklin, in the debates about the Articles of Confederation, is explicit that the term property has become closely connected to the defense of slavery and as such has acquired a degree of controversy that makes it not usable for some of their collective decisions. So this phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the phrase the abolitionists pick up on, they picked up on correctly. It was a phrase that was crafted by those in Continental Congress who were against slavery. And they were already at that time, right? So again, the document reflects different intellectual traditions, different viewpoints, alive and well simultaneously at the period of the founding. And if you look at the Constitutional Convention as well, you'll see exactly the same thing, that different signers of the Constitution signed on for different reasons. So a genuine originalism recognizes the diversity of opinion on which the founding rested. That already opens up a different way for thinking about our shared history. Our shared history is not one thing, it is many things, good and bad all the way through. And we need to be able to report the whole picture of our shared history to show the different traditions operating alongside each other, often in contestation, sometimes in collaboration and coordination. And to be honest about all those different phases of it, not needing to turn it into one thing or another. Now, the question of whether we can learn to tell a shared history that appreciates the founding, that appreciates the brilliance of the institutional design, that appreciates the wrestling with important ideals in human experience, that is honest about the domination of slavery and the genocide of Native Americans, the question of whether we can learn to tell such a history, to share it and work with it, is one that I think we have to work out in practice. That I actually think that the work of designing curriculum is something that communities need to do together, and to work together to find their way to those honest histories, honest and appreciative simultaneously. So a few more words before I close. I know we're getting close to our time. I want to talk now more concretely about civic education and how this picture I've offered about the content of civic education relates to what we do in practice. So, as I narrated the big picture account of what democratic knowledge consists of, I invoked basically every discipline in the humanities and social sciences, right? I basically made it sound like you need a full college education in order to have civic education. And I don't mean at the end of the day to argue for that. I think there's a lot that we can do in K through 12 across these territories. But I think it is important to pay attention to the fact that there are correlations between education in particular disciplines and domains in universities and civic participation. So it's been a piece of information for some time now that students who do spend their time in the social sciences, health professions, and the humanities are much more likely to participate than their colleagues in STEM fields, so by about a 10-point difference here. And there are other studies that have worked to disentangle self-selection effects, and the effect is repeated. That is to say, the students who are exposed to humanities and social sciences are much more likely to participate than students who are not. So to the degree that our policy paradigm has focused on investment in STEM education over the last 25 years, we've actually also been working against civic education. All right, so this is one of the kind of accidental, unintended consequences of how our educational policy paradigm has been shaped. The data on this comes out most dramatically in this particular piece from an article by a political scientist at Duke named Sunshine Hilligus, who, this is a complicated study. She controlled fully for self-selection effects and socioeconomic effects and things like that. But the short of it is, the higher your verbal score on the SAT, the more likely you are to participate, where that means voting. It also means writing letters to the editor, et cetera, a variety of kinds of participation. The higher your math scores, the less likely you are to participate. So as we think about civic education, it's partly about remembering to rebuild the humanities in colleges and universities, but also to rebuild them in K through 12 and make space in the curriculum for social studies. But we have to think too about whether or not there are different ways to teach STEM that also supports civic engagement and civic participation. Okay. So in Massachusetts, we do have, as I mentioned at the outset, a new policy paradigm that involves an 8th grade, a year-long course in civics for 8th graders. And the goal of my colleagues and I at the Democratic Knowledge Project is to unify in our delivery of this curriculum that core content, political institutions, the history of how this country's institutions were designed to deliver philosophical foundations of democracy, the exploration of ideals, to deliver a history of the country that's appreciative but not deifying, honest but not cynical, and finally to deliver those action skills of cooperation and coordination. And as we work on that, we're delighted to have that time in the curriculum to do that work, and we're also looking for opportunities to connect to our STEM colleagues and to reintroduce them to the importance of civic education for sustaining a healthy democracy. So the work is specific and nitty-gritty. I hope we might talk about that a little bit more in the question period. But even as you hear debates about civic education in Arizona and Arizona educational policy, the thing I think I'd like you most to keep in mind is that the aspiration for what we need is captured in that second sentence of the Declaration, where it envisions a citizenry capable of thinking about the foundation of principle for our democratic Republican institutions, and also that citizenry needs to be capable of thinking about how we organize the powers of government. So at the end of the day, those two things are fundamental and what we ought collectively to be delivering to our young people. Finally, if our polarization around our history prevents us from delivering that, I think that's a sin of our generation that future generations will judge unkindly, and rightly so. So I haven't provided the answers for how we get through our polarization. I've tried to provide one example. And I do think at the end of the day, this hard work on knitting together a shared story is necessary if we want to make progress on collectively rebuilding civic education. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I do want to get to the K12 questions, as you said, the sort of nitty-gritty, but I'd like to start with a university level question, which is, it arises commonsensically in a way. All teachers who teach in schools have, almost all, right, have university degrees of some sort or another. And so even if they are in an education school, let's say, or in a particular discipline, they're part of a university culture in their place and nationwide, which has certain views about what should be required of any university graduate. And I would think the same decline that you have documented about schools and requirements for a high school diploma. I've read literature which suggests the same is true of university and college graduation requirements or any general education graduate requirements. So am I thinking logically in that way that the general argument you made should also be a source of debate and discussion at universities about general education requirements for this broad kind of civic knowledge?
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, we had some sessions earlier today in which I was critical of my colleagues in economics departments, so I'm going to get a bad reputation for being an economics basher. But I do think that a lot of our educational policy for the last quarter century has been driven by an economic conception of what we need as a country. And there's a lot of truth to the picture of what we need with regard to the dissemination of STEM skills, for example, and the notion of the kind of education that secures a competitive economy. But the problem with the view is to think that the only thing we need is a competitive economy. And this is where, you know, if you look at international comparisons of education, where we hold ourselves up against China, we hold ourselves up against Singapore. They're not democracies. Our mode of education should be different from their mode of education. We have two things we're trying to do. You know, we want a competitive economy, but we also want to maintain a system of self-government. And that requires direct educational attention itself. So I do think at the higher education level, as well as at K through 12, we have to rebuild our capacity to see that part of the educational project. It's literally like we've acquired a kind of blindness to its existence.
A metaphor that I've used in conversation and teaching is that we take for granted the very liberal democratic political culture and institutions in which we live, so that when universities or public school systems or private schools are not teaching about these principles, we're deficit spending.
Right.
You know, we're
Yes.
just free riding
Yes.
on what has been built up, a kind of social, political,
Yep.
intellectual capital.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. No, I mean, I think this is one of the things that's hard to recognize. And part of the reason I use the slightly maybe trivial seeming example of committees and committee work is to make the point that there are bodies of knowledge that are necessary to running a democracy. So what committees do ultimately is called governance. Governance is a thing we don't actually see anymore as an activity, partly because Congress doesn't do it. Okay, but anyway. And the point of saying that is just we did build up such a deep expertise as a society in it that we actually forgot to name it as a thing that needs to be cultivated from one generation to the next. I think you're exactly right that we just took it for granted, as if democratic institutions run on their own. But that's not the case. A healthy democracy depends on a virtuous circle of political institutions on the one hand that are effective and functioning well, and a political culture that supports those with that knowledge and skills and dispositions which understand how to operate democratic institutions. So if you have effective institutions but nobody knows how to run them anymore, it won't work. So you just have to think about it in some sense like any other kind of machine, I mean, so, okay, we don't really use lots of kinds of 18th century technology any longer. That's the case, and we threw out the owner's manual a long time ago for, stone mills for grinding flour or various kinds of carpentry devices and things like that. So we still use the machinery we developed for our political life, but we forget to read the owner's manual anymore, right? So we're a bunch of 21st century people trying to operate machinery that was built in the 18th century, and nobody knows where the owner's manual is, okay? That's basically our situation. So yes, we can recover the owner's manual. Some of us have it. You have a beautiful copy of the Federalist Papers right there. Like, that's the owner's manual, okay, everybody? Like, that's your owner's manual. And so yes, we can rebuild that knowledge, and we need to. And I think putting the metaphor that way, too, though, makes a second point, which is to say, the machinery is sound on the whole, but that doesn't mean it need never change. I mean, we do also need to be redesigning the machinery for the very changed circumstances in which we currently find ourselves. So to recover this body of civic knowledge is not to fix some approach in time once and for all. It's instead to recover the capacity to understand how the machinery works and to figure out where we need tweaks and redesigns to make it work better for us.
The school developed just this past year a new board of advisors. We have a distinguished board of scholars, professors, who helped to build the curriculum in the school, but we've developed a second board that we call the Board of Counselors, and it's deliberately designed to ask the advice of experienced people in civic and political life about how we define civic education, and also about this principle of civil disagreement and civil discourse. And in listening to you, especially the statistic you mentioned at the beginning about millennials thinking this is not so essential, this liberal democracy thing. Don't tell Senator Kyle I said this, but he's a bit older and experienced, and the co-chair is Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, older and experienced. They seem to still understand the software, right? That our institutions are designed to provoke debate. You can't just be a dictator and get something done quickly, efficiently. Provoke debate, and then you understand the software behind the institutions.
Right.
So that challenge now is is across the board. It's in universities, it's in K12, it's in adult learners beyond either universities or K12 to try to rediscover and reestablish the importance of that connection between the software and the hardware.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'll give you an example of a place where I think our norms have eroded and make it harder for us to operate the software. And it's hard not to pick examples from one party or the other. Like, any example you pick will be one side or the other. So anyway, this one happens to come from the Republican side. I could find examples on the Democratic side too. But Mitch McConnell made the comment that winners make policy and losers go home. That's not the right software for operating this machinery, because it suggests that the point of democratic politics is, in effect, total war, that one side wins completely, the other side loses completely. You cannot sustain a democracy on that principle, because democracy depends on the losers wanting to stay attached to the thing. Otherwise, you end up in a kind of breakup or disunion situation. The correct software is the view that winners lead the policy-making process and incorporate losers into that process. That's the right software. That's a norm that political scientists call forbearance, that you're not seeking total victory, you're seeking limited victory. Leadership is what you're seeking, not total obliteration of your adversary.
Just two more questions from me, so folks be thinking about questions you'd like to pose from the floor. The success, as you were talking, I was thinking, the success of this original set of propositions, as Lincoln calls them, right? Natural rights from some sort of divinity or in the fabric of the universe, natural rights for all, over centuries, eventually ameliorates many forms of inequality and injustice, and produces, in many liberal democracies, a very pluralistic political community. As you said, we've always had different traditions, intellectual traditions, different religious traditions, and we're even more complex than we were in 1776 or 1789. So the success of the model also makes it a special challenge for this most complex era now into the 21st century. Am I right in thinking we have levels or kinds of challenges that preceding generations didn't have in educating ourselves about the software, the habits, the norms, as well as the hardware?
So we certainly have different challenges. I always hesitate to actually make a judgment about whether something is a greater or lesser challenge in a certain sense. It's that complicated question of which position you're describing a person as being in, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, in terms of different challenges, absolutely. And I think here's just one very concrete example. And I'm going to go back to that second sentence in the Declaration, if you'll forgive me for dwelling on it a little bit more, that distinction between laying the foundation on principle and organizing the powers of government. John Adams had debates with his wife Abigail about women and the place of women in American politics. And he also had debates with somebody, I think it was James Warren, I may be misremembering, about whether or not the vote should be opened up to men without property. And he gave roughly the same answer to both of them, which was basically that the principles, this securing of basic rights, that covers everybody. Okay, that's for women, that's for people with property. Everybody is supposed to benefit from that natural rights picture. He said, but the organization of the powers of government, that should be in the hands of men with property. That was his explicit answer. So he thought that you could separate the ideals and the rights and the kind of covering principles from how you organize the powers of government, and he self-consciously endorsed a sort of patriarchal form for organizing the powers of government. So Prince Hall, whom I just mentioned, right in 1777, disputed precisely that idea, that you can actually secure everybody's rights if you don't put power in everybody's hands. And then the suffragette movement disputed that as well. And so that's a place where we actually have seen the country achieve, make an intellectual advance collectively to make the discovery that those principles can't be separated from each other. If you want those principles and ideals to cover everybody, then power has to be organized so that everybody's included in its exercise. And so that discovery is something Americans should be very proud of as a society. And we are now involved in the very hard work of understanding what it truly means to put power in the hands of all, to share decision-making in an egalitarian way across all levels of society as well as through our political institutions. And so yes, that is a different challenge than previous generations had, and we're doing that in the context of one of the most diverse countries in the world, a country in which no particular group will be in the majority in very near future. And I think it's a beautiful challenge to have. I continue to have great confidence in the resilience of the American people to meet and master this challenge. But that's why I said it's not just a project of recovering the knowledge and wisdom from the 18th century. We need their knowledge and wisdom, but they actually were working on something different than what we're working on. So in that regard, we have to take responsibility, and we're the writers of the owner's manual now, and we need to do that work collectively. But we can do that work only if we rebuild the intellectual foundation for doing it.
Last question for me about the K12 work. It occurs to me while I was listening, enjoying your talk, that the history of debates could be a way to teach a next generation of adults, voters, citizens, about the content. Yeah. Points of principle that are agreed, shared, but then you dispute exactly what they mean, how to implement them. I was also thinking of religion. We have a pocket constitution I've showed to you that has the Gettysburg Address added to the Declaration and Constitution, and then Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, the I Have a Dream Address. He's the Reverend. Right. Dr. Martin Luther King. So there have been moments in our history when religion has in some ways been unifying, other moments when it's horribly divisive, especially for religious minorities. Right. So how to teach about debate as the reality, division and agreement, but also teach that underlying principle. This is what free people do. Right. They debate, they disagree. Yeah.
So we had an interesting conversation about this earlier today too for the podcast, and I made the argument that the right to free speech, which requires strong protection, should be coupled with a responsibility for proving oneself trustworthy to fellow citizens. And what that means is it's another way of putting that point I made about the norm of forbearance. That, yes, we need to debate, we need to teach students debate, but part of what we also need to teach them is the fact that as you debate, part of your responsibility is to preserve a community that can endure over time. And that requires, in fact, working to generate bonds of trust. And the best way to generate bonds of trust is to prove yourself trustworthy. From my point of view, that ethical commitment, okay, I'm not talking about a law, that like you gotta be a law that we have to be trustworthy to each other. Ethical commitment sits right alongside our right to free speech. So yes, say what's on your mind, say it the way you want to, and ask yourself if what you're doing is also proving your trustworthiness to your fellow citizens, because that's something you should be doing too.
Well, with that, we have a microphone in the center aisle. Time for brief questions from the audience. We do have a tradition of letting the first few questions be posed by students. But of course, then students have to take up their civic duty and actually show up at the microphone. Can't just say, I have a right to that first question. So we would like brief questions, and as is often said at our events, that means they should be brief and it should be a question. So go ahead, Jonah, you're first up.
Really good talk and session. I learned a lot, so thank you. So I guess my question, I think we're all familiar with the term, or this expression that winners write history. And I guess my question to you would be, how do we explore our historical context based on who's come out on top with it? How do we ethically do that? Who is the one who writes or like explores these histories? And you said committees or communities. And what if those communities are biased or skewed? Cool.
Thank you for your question. So I think this is one of the most important questions there is, and I don't have a great answer to it as of yet. So what I would like to do, the reason I shaped my remarks the way I did is because I would like to invite all of you, my fellow citizens, into a collective project of thinking about how we tell our shared American history. And so I think one way of doing that is, in fact, having specific sort of school districts work on that and share what they're generating with each other. So I think there's ways of building on the strength of the big democratic community, so not sort of individual isolated communities, to try out narratives and test them on each other and have a process of trying to work together over time to revise sets of materials for classrooms and so forth. And to some extent that's happening already on the ground. I had a great visit to Tucson yesterday and visited the Arizona History Museum. I loved it. It was fantastic. If you haven't been, you should absolutely go. And one of the things that was most remarkable about it, I found, was how well it did at telling the history of Arizona from multiple perspectives and being fair to all of them. So it used the language of ethnic cleansing to talk about the experience of Native Americans. It also talked about the experience of frontier families and the fears they had had of Native Americans, and sort of put all these different perspectives out there in the same place. And I thought that was exactly the right way to go ahead and try to talk about this history and try to put it together in one place. So I think we can see examples of success in this regard, of starting to integrate the different perspectives that different communities in our country have had on our history. And where we see those successes, I think we need to lift them up, hold them up as examples, and then see whether we can invite ourselves collectively into a bigger project of working in this way. Because literally, again, like I can't underscore it enough. Like, we don't have civics because we fight over history. So like, let's put down the arms, people, all right? Because it's too important to not have civic education. So we have to find a way of sharing how we tell our history across our different perspectives.
Going off that shared history thing, also, I love the manual comment. I'll take that with me.
Don't take the Federalist with you. Just,
You can
but
get it
you
on
can buy
Amazon
cheap
as
units
well.
online.
Exactly. There you go.
Yeah.
So the materialization of this issue, I think, is best seen in the statues,
Right.
and the university setting of the statues, or for example, renaming Washington and Lee University and wiping like Robert Lee off of the face of that campus. How would you like that is the fighting in its
That's
like,
right.
pinnacle.
Exactly.
So how
right.
would you recommend handling that type of situation?
So that's a great question, and so my view is that there are actually lots of different possible responses. It's not like there's a single cookie-cutter response to any particular issue. So let me just give you a couple of concrete cases on which I've articulated views to give you a sense. So Yale, for example, had the debate over Calhoun College, a residential college. I thought Calhoun should be renamed, and I wrote to the president and made that argument. And my reason for that is it's a residential college. The symbols of a university convey its values, and in the residential space, what you're doing is building a context of community where students are going to even be competing, bearing the sort of name Calhoun on their sweatshirts or whatnot. And my view was that it was not fair to ask students to sort of put up the flag for Calhoun as a part of being a part of a community. Now, I think Calhoun should stay in the curriculum. I think Calhoun should stay on syllabi. I think Calhoun should stay in libraries. So that question of how we use our symbols to build campus spirit is a different one from what our responsibilities as historians are. And I think you have to separate those kinds of questions. Now, another case, Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School. Yeah. Big debate over Woodrow Wilson. My take there was that they should have added a name. Okay, so I thought they should call it the Woodrow Wilson and W.E.B. Du Bois School of Public Policy. Nobody listened to me on that one, okay? But the point is that there's not one answer for each of these things. You have to make a judgment in each case, and you have to sort out the balance of appreciation and honesty, and then figure out what's the right package here for a response. In the South, I think lots of the answer is often about providing contextualization. So saying, this monument went up in 1910, not in 1860, because people were trying to rebuild an ideology actually of white domination. Okay, so I think that contextualization is sometimes, rather than taking something down, is sometimes the way to do it. If a community is ready to take something down and replace it with a new symbol, that's great for that community. Like, congratulations to them for having achieved a new sense of self-understanding of who they are. But at any rate, I think I've given you some concrete examples. From my point of view, it's case by case, but trying to use those kind of criteria of appreciate, don't deify, be honest, not cynical, and figure out what the right answer is.
Am I allowed to follow up?
No.
Okay. Well,
But stay for the reception, and we'll have, yeah, great, thank you. Next question.
Hi. My question has to do with the fact that you said that kids are political philosophers, and I noticed that before I turned 18, me and my peers, no matter what side of the aisle we were on, we were criticized for speaking up because we were kids and didn't know much. So I was just wondering how civic education can address this.
Oh, thank you for your question. So the research suggests that you really want to get going on civic education by 8th grade. That young people are coming into good self-awareness about their broader society, and they have curiosity about it, and they are natural political philosophers, and so that's the moment to connect and engage and start supporting the growth of their learning. What I say to adults who don't always want to take young people's perspectives seriously is that they're actually cutting themselves off from a huge body of valuable knowledge. And let me just give you a really concrete case. So this country has built the single biggest system of incarceration the world has ever seen. My first book was on punishment in antiquity, so I actually have studied punishment across millennia and around the globe. It's a truly remarkable production. Adults were too slow to recognize this. It was actually really youth activism that started to put this issue on the agenda. Why was that? Because young people were watching their peers, peer after peer, winding up in prison. So they could see, young people could see something happening, something bad happening to the world before older people could see it. And so I think older people need to recognize that the young person's perspective on the world is incredibly valuable, and we need it too as a part of our discovery apparatus for understanding the shape of our society.
You spoke a lot about narratives, but oftentimes narratives have questionable truthiness. You yourself highlight, there's often a conflict about the kinds of narratives to tell. So for me, this begs the question of, then what is the role of truth, but also falsehoods within narratives? Do narratives need to always be true in order to be beneficial?
Historical narratives do need to be always true, yes. So you asked. You asked.
So you would not then fall into the belief of those who think there can be such a thing as a beneficial lie?
No, I'm not a Platonist. I'm not a Platonist. No.
You do have a book on Plato.
I do have a book,
Yes.
it's true, called Why Plato Wrote.
Yes,
I think there's a lot you can learn from Plato. But no, I don't believe in beneficial lies. I think that democracy depends on an ethic of truthfulness among the citizens. And scholarship certainly depends on a commitment to the truth. So in both of those regards, I would underscore that. At the same time, as I said, historical narratives need to be true. Fiction is a beautiful, powerful thing that doesn't need to be true. And fiction can also help us build our intellectual capacities. And we were talking about this, there are all kinds of American novelists who have done as much to help extend the American moral imagination as any philosopher. So I'm thinking of Melville, for example. I'm thinking of Ralph Ellison. So I'm thinking of Toni Morrison. There is incredible power in a story. And certainly from the perspective of strengthening our moral imaginations, absolutely we need all of those untruthful fictional narratives as well. So in that regard, I'm making a strong distinction between history and scholarship and fiction and storytelling.
All right, thank you.
Just one footnote. We've asked quite a lot of Professor Allen on this trip to Arizona. She was in Tucson yesterday at University of Arizona. Today, we asked her to get up early and to attend a meeting at the Department of Education. But at different times in the talk, you used a metaphor from Martin Luther King Jr. in that "I Have a Dream" address. So it's this question of it's poetic to say what is the table of brotherhood,
Right.
at which Americans would all sit of different colors and religious faiths and traditions. So there's a power to that. It's not literally
Absolutely.
a table, or it could be, but doesn't have to be literally. It can be figurative and poetic. And yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, there's room for powerful metaphor all over the place. And certainly, I think when we think about civic skills, we think about debate, we think about that kind of adversarial speech. We think about deliberation, which is that kind of committee room speech that I was trying to describe. But then there's a third kind, which is prophetic speech, which is exactly what Martin Luther King did. And it does often use metaphors and images and fables and so forth, and has the capacity to, as I said, expand society's moral imagination, or in the case of King, to completely reorient the value framework of a society. And that sort of prophetic power, using language to change people's minds in that way, is another really important part of the skills of democratic citizenship.
Thank you. I am a co-founder of a nonprofit dedicated to increasing civic engagement in rural Arizona specifically.
Great.
So we're talking about applying this civic education to the K12 education system and the college system. My question is, how can we apply this to other communities outside of these, in my case specifically rural communities, outside of the educational system entirely?
That's a great question, and actually one of the gentlemen who was at the meeting this morning was from the O'Connor Institute. And they are working on adult and lifelong learning for civic ed, and I believe they do a fair amount of their delivery through online vehicles, and so I would recommend that contact for you. I think there is a burgeoning conversation nationally about adult civic ed and lifelong learning. And so I think stay tuned on that space, but start with the O'Connor Institute, because I think that would be a good connection into that conversation.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Well, another footnote, what Professor Allen is doing right here, right? The fact that she travels, and there are also institutions that are hosting her, universities, so this sort of speaker series and other speaker series. That's true harder for rural communities if they, but again, we have a video archive of everything that we do precisely because we think of this continual lifelong learning activity. So.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope this is not something that you had covered at the beginning. I came in a little late, but I had looked at some of your work on teaching the Constitution and that second line and how liberating that can be, and how simple it is with the 1,300 words that it is, and applying that to diverse communities. I'm also a co-founder, and I'm wondering how can we apply that type of education and be liberating for some folks in rural America and rural Arizona without it being captured kind of by the current, like those pet political projects that the current power structures in these communities like to capture the Constitution in. Right.
So you should give me your card afterwards and I can follow up and make some other suggestions about points of contact. But I think I can direct you to kind of bodies of resources that are available for building community conversations around civic education and engagement. So small readings that come with sort of structured discussions or various kinds of reflection exercises that begin to rebuild people's participatory skills. There are a number of providers now that are producing these kinds of things and can be used, and found electronically and so forth. So I'd be very happy to direct you to those resources.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Great.
Some years ago when I was teaching government at the high school level, I had to try and get my kids to think about basics, and one of the things is, Thomas Jefferson, we all know, all men are created equal. Well, was he thinking about women other than Sally Hemings? And also he had, from what you've said, very conflicted views on Africans and so forth and so on. So who are the people? Well, when I hear politicians now say, the American people want blah, 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 or our Attorney General say the American people are okay with this 4 pages, and I want the whole report. Where do we get people to do exactly, it sounds very minute, getting down to talking to individuals. I'd love to talk to Attorney General Barr and explain to him why I think, you know what I mean? How, and what, besides forming a committee, what other ways do we have to not only ourselves participate at that micro level, but get our students to see the importance of that?
Thank you. So I take the point of, it is, politicians do often invoke a concept of the American people as a rhetorical maneuver, right? It's not literally true that every single person agrees with this thing that they're trying to articulate a justification. And so in some of the work we do, we have built a structure for teaching young people both how to undertake voice projects and how to undertake influence projects, we call them. And so we first actually invite young people to think about the difference between voice and influence. So voice is, that response you had. I want to be heard. I want people to know that this part of the American people, right, doesn't actually agree with that. And then sometimes you want not just to be heard and counted, but you actually want to have an influence on a specific policy, et cetera. So I think, the answer to the question of where to start depends on where you are and what the opportunities are. But so what we do in teaching is sort of first get kids to sort out whether what they want to do is a voice project or an influence project. And then we get them to kind of anatomize in their own community what are the opportunities for voice, what are the opportunities for influence, and then they pick one and then they start to act on that. So the answers are slightly different in every community depending on the structure of local newspapers, or are there digital outlets, or is there a city council that holds hearings on issues you care about, et cetera. But that's the kind of process we work young people through, always starting from this question of what do you care about, what matters to you and why. So it's a sort of reflection process that starts from that first kind of discovery of intentionality about one's own purposes.
Last 2 questions.
A lost part of the Constitution is the responsibility of the government to promote the general welfare. Would you tell me what you think that means in terms of promoting that? And can we get to promoting the general welfare without having the civic discussion and civic education that you're proposing?
Right. So that phrase in the Constitution I love, and also I love it because it's an echo, oh, my sentence is gone here. It's an echo of that last phrase, safety and happiness, in the Declaration of Independence. Safety and happiness is like the first version of the general welfare idea, and both of those phrases go back to the Roman phrase that salus populi suprema lex est, which means the salus, the health or well-being of the people, is the supreme law. Everything else has to come back to that. And so you're right that in order to test whether or not everything we do is connected to the general welfare of the people, the only way to answer that is to hear back from the people, right, about this issue of general welfare. So I do think, I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier today. If you take the example of economic policy, that's a zone where we have a very good example of policy kind of proceeding, and sort of technocratic economic policy proceeding through the sort of period of globalization without paying attention to what was happening to specific communities, sort of not hearing back from people. So I think when you see that kind of disconnect between policymaking and its impacts on communities, we do have to ask ourselves about whether our institutions are functioning appropriately. I mean, another example of that would be the impact of criminal justice and the approach to the war on drugs, which has been devastating for significant portions of our population. And policymakers have been, I mean, they've woken up now, but they were too slow to wake up to the degree of devastation that some parts of our population were experiencing.
The Declaration of Independence has to do mostly with the functions of government, as does the Constitution, as do these documents. But most of our lives don't have anything to do with government. And I'm wondering if government hasn't grown so large that some of these problems that you refer to wouldn't exist if government wasn't so big and didn't get involved in so much of our lives.
So I think I would actually dispute your premise, to be honest. I think that the fact that we live in a place of peace and prosperity is due to the fact that we have sound political institutions. And I think we should give our government credit for that fact. Now, that doesn't mean that everything the government does is good, and it doesn't mean that it should be this size or that size. But I actually think it's fundamentally incorrect, you'll pardon my being direct in that way, to say that actually government mostly is not involved in our lives. Every single one of us benefits from peace and prosperity, which we do generally have, and that is due to the soundness of our political institutions. And I do think we actually should recognize that and be thankful for it. So I feel like we should start there, and then I think it's a kind of open question. If you sort of look at the array of policies, which ones are the product of too much government involvement and which ones are the product of the wrong kind of governmental involvement. So if I go back to the, let's just say, sort of issue of the well-being of urban minority populations, there's one approach to thinking about that, which is about this sort of view that the answer lies in more services. In my view, the answer is actually no, there's been too much government activity, and in particular, too much criminalization. And if we reduce the degree of criminalization and reduced incarceration, you would discover flourishing communities. So yes, I think the answer in different policy zones is sometimes there's too much government. I don't think that's always the answer. I think one has to do the work of diagnosis from issue to issue and come to a judgment.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have a reception coming, which we can talk with each other, and perhaps Danielle will take some more questions over the lemonade and the reception. This is our final event of the year, so I do have a few closing remarks before we get to the reception. I see learners out there of all ages, as Professor Allen has mentioned. So for those of you who are university students or about to be university students, please look at the information we have outside or find our website to see our lineup of courses in the fall, a major and a minor. We're starting a master's degree particularly directed at school teachers. We have for high school students, so for parents and family members out there, we have 2 summer institutes in June in residence at the Barrett Honors College, very substantially subsidized by the school, one on Lincoln and Lincoln's political thought, one on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And there's a flyer outside about that. You can also find it on our website. Everybody of all ages can take a pocket Constitution that's outside. And also, we have a new dimension this year, a podcast, which is called Keeping It Civil. The first episodes of the podcast have already aired, and they're mostly speakers we have brought to ASU in this series. Professor Allen mentioned she was interviewed for the podcast earlier. So you can start to find those links to the podcast, Keeping It Civil, on our website. So lots of information outside, lots of information on our website. Thanks to our partners last year and again this year, Arizona PBS, terrific folks to work with. I want to say 2 notes of special thanks to our school staff and faculty. So Dr. Carol McNamara is our Associate Director in the School for Public Programs. She leads up this team, our events team, also our communications team. Terrific work. I'm just the pretty face sitting up here, getting to enjoy these extraordinary speakers we bring in. Carol is doing the hard work of getting people to come and scheduling all of this, and the events team and the communications team. So that would be Catherine and Taylor and Joe and Lauren, Gayla, other staff, our student workers who make all of this possible. I want to say a special note at the end of the year to our faculty who are also behind the scenes at public events like this. They're teaching terrific courses, mentoring students in all kinds of ways. And a special note of thanks somewhere to Adam Seagrave, who came on as Associate Director of the school this year. I'm walking and still alive this year because Adam came on and I put a lot of work on him, on his shoulders, and he's done a marvelous job joining the team. 2 things that he's done, among many other things, had a conference just last week, students from different universities all around the country coming together to talk about American political thought as a student symposium to share their writing and their research. And then this coming weekend, next weekend, a course on race in the American story that he's been teaching, a project he started at University of Missouri. It's now spread from University of Missouri to University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the course is now being taught here. And that symposium is bringing students and some faculty from all 3 campuses with a speaker. So congratulations and thank you to Adam. So with that, thank you for coming. We have a reception until 7 o'clock. Please join and stay conversation with each other. And one more time, let's please thank Professor Danielle Allen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.